Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note that we're already behind schedule, which I think was predictable, so I'll try to be very succinct. I was interested in the conversation about the cost of choice. I don't have a question related to this, but I wonder also what's the cost for those children trapped in failing schools for the lack of choice long term. I just threw that out for thought. We've discussed quite a bit the funding and the funding formula. And I'd like to discuss a little bit. Someone made a comment about funding should follow the child and made the point that of course it doesn't. It doesn't follow the child from the state to the local school district. My concern was sort of this piecemeal approach with focusing on the funding of charter schools is that, in fact, we should take a more comprehensive view, which I think this General Assembly attempted to do last summer. And I note with some irony that report would have been back to the General Assembly by now, that we would have had some information and actionable information, I believe, at this point. My concern with the piecemeal approach is that we perhaps are taking away legitimate options for students. I am interested in the conversation, though, about students in two different school districts receiving different allocation of funds as it flows from the state. Shouldn't we really start there? Shouldn't this conversation, rather than focusing exclusively on the funding for charters and cyber charters, I agree with you, the concerns of the inequity in funding coming from the state. Shouldn't this conversation, therefore, really begin there? I'd like you to comment on that.
Thank you. I think there are two ways to look at that. One is, should we hold off on doing some of the obvious stuff that generates the immediate relief while we look for a grand bargain? I mean, I think that's a mistake to do that. If we've got the obvious things that we can do, the improvements that we can make immediately, we should do them. We shouldn't wait because the grand bargain could be very, very elusive when it comes to that. The whole funding scheme should be reopened and looked at. And that is what you point out about the fact that the tuition rates being paid for two students in the same charter school could be wildly different. Special education is one of the problems right there because it doesn't bear any relationship to costs. And, a student who needs a very small amount of intervention is going to bring the same tuition, divert the same amount of additional public funds from the school district as a child who needs a much greater degree of intervention. And that can cut both ways as well. That can be detrimental to the charter school as well, in addition to being detrimental to the school district. But so we certainly agree that the whole funding formula needs thorough examination, but we don't think that should hold up doing the things we know right now can provide immediate corrections that should happen.
To follow that up, your associations that you represent, the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials and the Pennsylvania School Boards Association, have your respective associations, I take it you have very specific positions on this legislation as it relates to charter and cyber charter funding. Is there a similar consensus within your organization regarding funding reform as it flows from the state to the local school districts? And I'd like you to specifically comment on, do your organizations have a position on hold harmless?
You're talking about for all funding, hold harmless all funding statewide?
That's correct. The point, what I'm trying to get at is I understand there's some consensus as it relates to the funding of charters and cyber charters. Is there similar consensus within your organizations as far as the inequities that exist in the funding as it flows to your school districts? And specifically, your organizations have what I view to be an inequity of the hold harmless provision. Is there a consensus in your associations as it relates to that specific issue?
I mean, obviously, if you've got school districts that are benefited by hold harmless aspects of the way we have been funding public education, they're not going to be very happy if that suddenly just disappears and there isn't some other correction that makes the funding make sense. I think what our members do have a consensus about is that we need a public education funding scheme that is reliable, that is consistent, that is predictable, that can be a basis for budgeting, that has some relationship to the actual costs of what it takes to educate children, and that is based based on the number of children being educated. And unfortunately, the kinds of, we haven't had a funding scheme that has done any of those things for more than 20 years. And that's the problem, and I think you'll find great consensus among our membership that that needs to be fixed.
We do not have a position on either the maintenance or the elimination of hold harmless.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the comments, and I would submit I think that's where the conversation should perhaps begin. Thank you.